Can I be heard?
Yes, you can.
Perfect. Okay. Two misconceptions in opening government I want to clear up immediately. Firstly, there has been a historical massive underdiagnosis issue with respect to people's mental health empirically for structural reasons. One, it is an inconvenient truth, and it's easier to say that somebody is just a hyperactive boys being boys as opposed to I am mentally ill or I am disabled. It is something which has a massive stigma associated with it, and as a result, people do not opt into this lightly. Parents do not pay for you to go to the doctor lightly. It is easier for them to not bring you. Secondly, there's a hesitancy of doctors to diagnose you as such. The reason for this is that they do not want to face any backlash or inquiries if it turns out that they medicalize you and that causes harmful effects down the road. Thirdly, there's a lack of funding historically into mental health facilities. For instance, the head is just seen as less important than the body. Those who suffer from mental health afflictions are also often poor for their entire life because they're structurally disadvantaged from the starting point, as opposed to people who get like cancer and were productive or no longer. As a result, they don't have the money to be able to pay for these sorts of treatments historically, which has meant that they have not been prevalent. Fourthly, there's a huge stigma over self-diagnosing and talking to people. It is very difficult to express symptoms. It's very difficult to talk about the bullying and harassment you've experienced in order for you to realize you might have been autistic. And as a result, people do not want to go forward. Therefore, there's an underdiagnosis issue in the status quo. Secondly, on drugs, they don't work the way they think. It's difficult for you to get on your hands on drugs because of the stigma against being diagnosed and because testing is extensive. There are medical ethics boards that exist in the status quo. There are massive lawsuit cultures that exist against being misdiagnosed as it exists. There's also a need to convince people that they are at the very least suffering from mental health affliction by carrying out extensive testing with them, by talking about their past lived experiences. And as a result, there is a long pathway in order to get diagnosed. Like, I think the average informed voter knows this too. As a result, at the very least, people consent into the harms that opening government talk about, but they never able to consent to the benefits I'm going to talk about in the absence of this rise. Two arguments. One, you create more capital for solutions. Three layers to this argument. One, more people suffer more people who are suffering realize they are suffering at the point at which they are diagnosed, and therefore they want a cure. They understand they are trapped inside their head. They understand they're not able to focus on their tasks. They have to hoard possessions, or else they fear that their family's life will be in danger if they don't give it up. Or even on the most micro level, they feel as if they can't make eye contact with people. The noise is too loud and they must leave their classroom because they're overstimulated. These sorts of things mean that people want a way of understanding themselves and they want a way to be able to solve this. Therefore, the market for things that help out people who are neurodivergent or who are suffering mental health afflictions is much larger on our side of the house. It means that there's more money going into this market to create fidgets, to create how-to tutorials and how to deal with things that you're dealing with, to support helplines. I cannot emphasize the impact of this enough. This saves people's lives when they're able to no longer be at the brink of stress where they have no life raft coming for them. Notice, this rise led to 4 big benefits that I want to talk about specifically within the market. A, scrutiny on products. More people use the existing products that were there in the status quo. People who might be less, like quote unquote, less autistic or like less ADHD, and as a result, they have a greater capacity to advocate for the problems that exist and actually be believed when they talk about the issues with these products, as opposed to the comparative, where in the status quo, you can create shitty products and the people who you're selling them to never are able to hold you accountable as they do not have the mental faculties to do so. Secondly, there's more trial and error, which means that when more people try products, they're able to understand which ones are good and able to recommend them to others through online means and stuff like this. Thirdly, increased producers in the space decreases the price and increases the quality because they have to compete with each other. They have to undercut to sell cheaper goods, to sell cheaper courses, to give better quality stuff, which is like basic competition analysis. If there's more demand, there's more suppliers, there's greater quality and stuff like this. The fourth thing to say is that medical researchers can now trial more frequently on a larger number of subjects. More people are willing to actually go forward and talk about and give consumer feedback on what they've interacted with. There are 3 impacts of this. 1, everyone can benefit. I don't have to like have massive medication. I can just walk out of my room when I'm having an autistic meltdown, and I never understood that it was that before I was told it. Secondly, it helps those who are the most severely hurt and those who are the most vulnerable, who they want to access on their side of the house, who also access these products. Thirdly, yes, it leads to cheaper medication, and this medication can be beneficial and save people's lives in many cases. It is a stupid argument to say that SSRIs are outright like bad. There's a reason why they're invented. There's a reason why millions of people the world over rely on them for their continued existence. The comparative, they might say people can self-diagnose. Two reasons why it doesn't work. One, people don't take this as seriously because it isn't given by a medical professional. Two, one created the other, because when these diagnoses were created by medical professionals, then people have the language to self-diagnose at a cheaper price into the future. Another impact for opening opposition. Second layer to this, political capital is created, which means that there's more people who can vote on the issue for the government to reallocate healthcare spending towards focusing on mental health. This is a good thing for two reasons. One, your mental health affects your ability to recover from physical illnesses, the placebo effect, the fact that if you feel as if you're miserable and you're not going to be able to survive this, you're not even able to recover on their side of the house. So yes, this is a good allocation of resources. Secondly, there's already enough research into things like cancer and the status quo. There's billions and billions of dollars going in, given the underdiagnosis framing I've given. This hasn't existed historically for mental health. The third thing to say, just implicating a thing that I said earlier, is that there's just more volunteers for medical trials, which means that the analysis here is a certain number of people are willing to volunteer. When more people are in a pool of people who believe they could be suffering, then more people actually volunteer just as a percentage. This means you're able to study more brains, understand how SSRIs interact with people's brains, understand how you can make antidepressants and stuff like this better, which means we correct for the problem which opening opposition asserts. Second argument on how this gives people a language to understand themselves. Before that, a POI, quick. All right, I'll move on. This argument is to say that people are able to understand themselves. It is really fucking difficult to not understand your head and to feel something that is uncanny that you're not able to describe. Firstly, society isn't built for you. Methods of coping which work for normal people, like going out and drinking with your mates, doesn't work for me because I get overstimulated, because I'm tired talking to these people. It doesn't give me solace. It makes me worse. Secondly, there's an epistemic gap because other people can never understand what it's like to be inside your head. Consequently, you're trapped in your own lived experience. I cannot explain to my girlfriend why I cry when I have a towel that is rough on the beach, when that is just normal for other people, but the sensory input is too great. The third thing to say is stigma, which is that only ones who have had extreme symptoms were diagnosed historically, which means that you associate yourself as being like other people. So you think that autism means to not be able to speak, or depression means that you're standing on like a balcony or something, whereas that isn't the case for most people, which means that you get lumped in with this. We say that we fix this in a couple ways because more people are able to discuss this and there's more of an understanding of what affects people. Three benefits of this. One, you're more willing to avail of supports that exist in the status quo when you understand that you fit under this broader umbrella. Two, people are less likely to bully you and discriminate against you when you have a label because it's massively taboo. It can lead to them to losing things like their jobs. They can't just say you're weird. Now you're autistic. Now if they say that, they're going to the fucking HR. Thirdly, you're better able to find a community of people like you online and stuff like this who suffer like you, who you can interact with, you can share like comfortable spaces with. For all these reasons, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that fine speech.
Okay, sorry. Can I be heard?
Yes, we can hear you and can see you.
Okay, perfect. Let me just grab the timer super quick. I don't know where I put my phone. I'll take POIs verbally. I don't check chat. Okay. I want to just respond to what we hear from opposition, because I think this is actually a series of pretty bad arguments, right? Firstly, on this idea of restructuring society, which is very loosely touched on, but I don't want it to be credited heavily. Notice, in a world where we legitimize and pathologize and understand that it is actually bad that conditions, like people have very high anxiety levels, and we actually say that this is legitimate and this is something that occurs in the mind, in the wide stream, then you support social movements that have stuff such as like, I don't know, having like more continuous testing instead of one set of exams, right? And so I actually think it's on our side that we actually get social movements that lead to broader social change when we have an increased trend in pathologization, because we have an increased group of people that are affected by this and we recognize it as a legitimate issue. I think it is uniquely on our side we get that benefit, so it should be on our side, not on their side. And I also think they don't really prove this at all. Anyways, secondly then, this idea that you do get pathologization and it was good, and they tell us that like the most vulnerable people do not get medication on their side of the world because there's an overcrowding. Firstly, I want to note that a lot of medications never existed before this trend of pathologization. Pharmaceutical companies do not like developing a drug and having a drug test is incredibly expensive. When there's a small number of people that are affected by an issue, they never invest in it. And so it is actually to say that like the most vulnerable people probably never accessed medication at all. And so we think it is very important for them to access medication when it is the case that their life is otherwise debilitated. They actually cannot go outside. They actually like have such bad hormone like serotonin balances that they feel like they're going to harm themselves in significant ways. And a lot of these medications do not exist in a world where there isn't enough of a market that like need lower prescription versions of that. Secondly, economies of scale just exist. And so like it is actually true that it is likely that medication was likely to get cheaper on our side, and so it was more accessible to the most vulnerable people. Notice Andy's analysis as to why like the most vulnerable people often do not have the most capital to invest in this medication, because they've like probably been raised really like as they've grown up, like it's been hard for them to succeed in the world. So a lot of people who get diagnosed later in life maybe don't have the money to spend a lot on like expensive medication. So on our side of the house, we actually make it affordable and accessible to them. But thirdly, just note competition metrics that are in place. When more people are going to want to buy this medication, more pharmaceutical companies begin to develop those drugs, and so actually it gets cheaper. I think it was on our side that uniquely we were able to access these medications that they weren't on their side. But secondly, you were actually able to afford more cheap therapy, because a lot of people can't afford therapy, but it was only when there was a trend towards like trying to understand your mental health more. And notice some people don't end up getting pathologized on our side of the world, but rather in a world where people care about being pathologized and people understand that like it is not something to be embarrassed about, then they still go to therapy. And when like and maybe they end up being told, no, you actually aren't anxious, you're just a bit worried. And some people end up with anxiety diagnoses. Both of these exist. Not everyone who goes to therapy like ends up getting an anxiety diagnosis, but it also doesn't mean they don't benefit from this and understanding why they like feel a certain way. But notice then when you have a far bigger market of people that care about their mental health, then you also have things like online therapy, which is far more accessible and far more affordable than other things. So it wasn't just medication that got more affordable, but it was all sorts of therapy. And then also just notice that like free forms of it, like on the internet, also got far more accessible, because there's just far more online resources. The government puts more towards it. For all of these reasons, I think it was better for everyone, even those who do not have diagnosed things, because they cared more about their mental health, learned more about their mental health, and we made it more accessible for the most vulnerable, but also like just general people. Secondly, on fake diagnoses, I actually just would posit that like the really rich people who use it for exams were likely to get diagnosed on both sides of the house, because they have extreme amounts of capital, extreme amounts of money. They'll find a doctor that agrees with them. And so I actually don't think this applies in this world, this trend of getting diagnosed. If they knew it would advantage their kids, people have historically gone around like jumped through hoops and horses to get into like Harvard or whatever. And so I think they were likely to do this anyways. But notice then that like, so I actually just does not think it affects these people. But then finally on this idea of stigma, right? Like they claim that on their side of the house, you still got kids who were severely had bad ADHD, who got in like fights or whatever, were getting diagnosed on their side of the house. I would posit this actually maybe is not true in a world where there's no trend of pathologizing, because I think teachers just are less aware and they just think this kid is a really bad kid and acts out significantly. I actually think the most vulnerable kids still do not get diagnosed on their side, or quite often do not get diagnosed on their side. And so if they admit that we care about them the most because they're incredibly vulnerable and it affects their life quite significantly, I think it was the case that a lot of them still continue to not get diagnosed on their side of the house. For all of those reasons, I think it is broadly true that the most vulnerable people didn't get diagnosed or couldn't access medication for a cheap or therapy at a cheap cost on their side of the house. So even if we care about the most vulnerable people in society, like who have the most significant effects, I think we were winning on this. Secondly, then I want to talk about this idea of overprescription. I want to note on framing that a trend towards pathologizing does not mean there's a trend towards giving drugs to everyone. Notice by their own analysis, they point out that there's side effects that occur with these drugs, such as like heart palpitations from Adderall. These are strong incentives why doctors who are trained and clearly care about their patients are not going to give it to people that should not otherwise have access to it. And just because they claim, who are uneducated, not medical people, that like maybe 50% of America doesn't have anxiety, does not mean that is true, right? But secondly, then, I think in the case where there is like a short supply, you do actually prioritize people. I think doctors know this, and they do prioritize the most vulnerable people and will give them prescriptions more than other people. We do this all the time in the medical industry when we prioritize like the people who are like the sickest for an organ donation. So I actually don't understand why short supply meant most vulnerable people weren't going to access it. But finally, I would note that a lot of the time we actually prefer behavioral or therapy solutions because they're more affordable, but secondly, they're more long-term, right? Like it doesn't require you to always continue to pay and buy drugs. And so I don't think it was the case that even people ended up getting overprescription in the vast majority of cases, mitigating significantly their overprescription arguments. And we say that we still access the benefits of behavioral stuff for the vast majority of people. But secondly, even if that is not true and loads of people did end up getting prescriptions, I want to give a few responses as to why I think those prescriptions were probably better on our side. Notice like pharmaceutical corruption or like bad pharmaceutical practices were likely to occur on both sides, but obviously where the medicine is going to far more people, you're far more likely to figure out that certain medical practices are bad, right? Like obviously lobotomizing people in the past because they had BPD was quite bad, but because so few people were affected by it or it was so stigmatized, no one really checked on this. Notice there's a far higher incentive from politicians to have stronger oversight and check far stronger on our side where more people are affected. And so even if it is the case that maybe a lot of people get an unnecessary prescription, I think the small dose of that unnecessary prescription's harm is significantly less than the extreme amount of harm that can come from bad medication that isn't overlooked and can lead to actual really significant side effects such as death, right? But secondly, then notice that even if you need chemical substances to cope with your mental health, it is actually better to get an FDA approved drug than turn to alcohol or drinking. Because no, Gen Z maybe takes more depression medication than any previous generation that exists, but we also drink far less. And so maybe it is the case that pathologizing, there was actually a huge underdiagnosis that Andy specifically highlights in his case. And it is actually the case that we're just dealing with it in a better way and people are turning to better coping mechanisms and better chemical solutions than turning towards other substances to escape this feeling that you couldn't otherwise understand or diagnose. Finally, on this idea that doctors will just play along. They have licenses, they care about their work, they spend extreme amounts of time going to debt to become a doctor. The fact that they know that side effects exist mean that they're probably unlikely to just unnecessarily diagnose you with bad things. For all of these reasons, I think we are winning in the top half of this debate, most definitely.
Thank you very much for a very fine speech, and I want to welcome the Member of Government to continue the case on Government Bench. Here.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Fantastic. My time will start on my next word there. I think there's been a major misconception in this round, especially from op bench, about the idea of pathologization and adding labels to people is going to make the situation better instead of irreparably worse. CG is going to bring you the main extension on where this debate is going to be focused on, and we believe the Infoslide says it best. It's supposed to be focused on children for a couple key reasons. One, children have less ability to get help, have less resources than adults do. They depend on their parents for everything. And if their parents don't say yes or say no to something, they can't have it. Two, there's just less people for children to turn to. They're not as knowledgeable about the world as adults are. Therefore, if they're suffering from a mental health crisis, there are less resources for them to turn to, especially if mental health is more stigmatized than ever before. And we're going to prove that as our main extension for pathologization. First, what even is pathologization? By the Infoslide, the definition of pathologization is given is to view as characterized as abnormal. That is the label that a lot of people are being hit with that opposition forgets about. Even if you're diagnosing these people, the major perception around pathologization is you are labeling these people as wrong. You are not giving them the help. In a lot of cases, let's look at where pathologization happens most. It's the most impact of it is when it's done incorrectly, and it's not going to be done by doctors or diagnoses as a lot of opening. Sorry? Oh, no. As a lot of opening half believes, it's going to be done more informally in everyday life, by family, by friends, by teachers in school. A lot. So let's go on to the first one. One, pathologization is going to be done very poorly by the vast majority of Americans or people in the Western world. One, the medical definitions are very, very confusing, even to doctors, not less of what it looks like to an average citizen. One, you're being given a bunch of labels and a bunch of numbers and stats that you have no idea how to possibly interpret. Two, because of the nature of medical documents, especially mental health documents, for an average person reading this, you're going to get very confused. You don't know what's going on. You don't know whether or not your child has this condition, whether they don't have the condition. What if you're making a mistake? And that causes a lot of stress. Three, scientific data constantly changes. Doctors, sure, they can keep up with the change in information. It is literally their job to keep up with the latest study. What if you're just an average parent working a 9 to 5? You have no idea what's going on. You don't know what the constantly changing medical labels mean. You don't know what this random new study about depression means. So you could be operating on improper or information or just wrong information in general. Next, the nature of social media. What most people receive their information from social media and news sources. What news sources tend to do, especially for mental health and scientific studies, is they tend to blow them out of proportion because that generates news feed. What this means is that not only are you getting maybe outdated information, the vast majority of the information you get from pathologization on how to label people, on how to understand this mental illness, is going to be very, very wrong because it's been purposely exaggerated by the media in order to generate more buy-in and feedback. Why is this a terrible thing? The second burden then is that a lot of this information is going to be put on children who, one, there's three outlets that this is going to apply to. The first one is on the parents. Parents are where children are going to get most of their information. It's where a lot of the times they interact with the adult world because they do it on behalf of their children. Why is this going to make the situation worse for people for both parents with children with mental health or two parents who just don't, or two parents in general? The first one is improper diagnosis. We've been dealing with a lot of misdiagnosis on children, people diagnosing people without mental illness, but the problem is, what have you an improper diagnosis? A couple key reasons why parents are likely to diagnose their children wrong. Either they don't have a mental disorder and they're diagnosed as one, they have a disorder and they're diagnosed as not having one, or they have a mental disorder and parents just say or just get diagnosed them with the wrong one. The first one, why is it likely that parents are going to be doing a lot of the diagnosis themselves instead of going to a doctor? The first one is mental health doctors are incredibly expensive. And two, the nature of mental health, and especially the pathologization and popularization of it, makes a lot of people think they could do it themselves. Parents especially, they are subject to the same echo chambers as their children are. They have their own Facebook and etc. Why is this a terrible thing? Because with the pathologization and the increasing trend of just labeling people, they're likely to label their children with the wrong disorder and give them the wrong or improper treatment instead of actually going to a doctor. This is going to be even worse for the children because not only are they suffering from a potential mental disorder, they're being constantly told parents are incredibly stressed. They try to tell them how they should deal with it instead of giving them actually proper treatment, which results in this situation getting worse for the child as overall. The second way where it gets worse for children, at school. This is where children are going to spend a lot of their time, and this is where the mental illness is going to get exasperated. Because when you label someone, you don't give them better. Opposition and government assumes that when you label someone with a mental illness, you're going to get the proper help. We're going to explain why schools, one, aren't able to give the proper help. Two, a lot of cases are going to ignore it or just give it out poorly. The first one is when you label a child with a mental illness, a lot of cases, people in the school don't understand it. You are literally isolating them from their peers because one, you are telling everybody in the school there is no way to keep this information quiet or it spreads often that something is wrong with this child, which leads to a lot of bullying from all their peers. And the second way is that a lot of cases you are physically isolating the child from their peers because there are special classes for people with mental disorders. By increasing these labels, you are preventing them from getting the help they properly need. I'll take a POI before I continue.
CO?
Yeah.
You're precisely correct. People are really bad at interpreting scientific data. They really are vulnerable to being preyed on quacks, and they really are vulnerable to social media creating bad consensuses and bad information. The difference is on our side, we get a top-down narrative that is dictated by the medical community that people are more likely to buy into, whereas on your side, all of your worst fears come to pass. It's way more likely bad things happen.
The top-down narrative, as I've explained thoroughly, is not going to be done properly. You assume it's going to go from medical professionals right down to parents and etc. That's not how it works at all, as I've explained. It's not medical professionals to parents. It's medical professionals to journalists and newspapers and social media who then interpret it and spread it down to parents and everyone else, therefore making it so much worse. Carter is going to elaborate more on that. That's why overall it gets much worse for the children because not only are their parents freaking out for potentially misdiagnosing them, not getting them the proper treatment due to misunderstanding of the information they were given, but now because they are openly labeled as problematic as per the definition of pathologization, as different and abnormal, they are isolated from any support school group they could have at school. Overall, they could get so much worse in your world. Overall, focus.
Thanks so much for that very fine speech. And I'd like to welcome the member of opposition to open the case on closing opposition. Yeah.
Can people hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Cool. Starting in 3, please put POIs in the chat. Starting in 3, 2, One, CG is precisely right. People are very bad at figuring out what's wrong with them. They're vulnerable to being played upon by quacks. They're very bad at interpreting scientific data. It's precisely for this reason we need pathologization, which creates a top-down mechanism by which we're able to clarify and explain to the public the medical consensus in accurate terms, rather than a bottom-up one fueled by social media that causes people to turn to quacks, turn away from the medical community, and harms minorities and the most vulnerable. I'm going to explain that, and in doing so, fill 3 gaps in OO, first on awareness, then on minorities, and finally on research and development. First, on awareness. Opening opposition says that people don't understand themselves, and this gives people a language by which they can understand the way they feel due to epistemic gaps. Very beautiful rhetoric, but the problem is it's symmetric. This happened as a consequence of increased awareness of mental health on either side of the house by their own analysis and opening government. This is for 3 reasons, even if they're not spelled out in the DSM, why awareness is going to happen more. First, social media has provided a platform where people can compare notes and discuss conditions on both sides of the house. As autism rates rise among people with autism, people may not know it's a symptom of the condition, but they become aware that those symptoms are becoming more prominent anyway, and they discuss about it on social media. Secondly, the destigmatization around certain types of healthcare, like healthcare for gender dysphoria or women's healthcare, have become less stigmatized as the increased liberalization and the rise of social movements to advocate for these groups of people has made them easier to talk about, and in general, the world has become more liberal in Western liberal democracies. And thirdly, the thing that CG is actually concerned about happens way more on their side of the house, because on our side, even in our worst case, we get a countervailing narrative, right? One that comes from the medical community. But I actually posit it's probably a pretty good and clear medical narrative, because firstly, you can use the accountability mechanisms OO already analyzed, but secondly, most people don't interface with medicine and the doctors all the time. They do so when they're sick, and therefore they recognize that they aren't as educated on these kinds of issues, and they're likely to buy into the medical system. And thirdly, in the absence of this narrative, there's likely to be some greater degree of trust in the medical system. It's your first port of call when you're sick. You often know your doctor. You're more likely to trust them to have an authority on the matter, and you're more likely to buy into those kinds of narratives. The conclusion of all of this is that the pressure for self-diagnosis and solutions are symmetric, which means that on either side of the house, there's likely a significant amount of public awareness of mental health that grows and grows. The question is where people use that awareness and how they engage with solutions. On our side, the presence of these things in the DSM and the understanding of these broad trends that similarly affect people in similar ways, i.e. diagnoses, when they respond to medication similarly, occur and rise to the top of discourse. On their side, you get to divisions, and this is where we flip the CG impact. Why is this the case? Firstly, people, in the absence of umbrella terms to understand diagnoses, are far more likely to be vulnerable to people spreading misinformation online, right? We give them that clear-cut diagnosis from a community source that's likely to be close to them. People feel a greater degree of reassurance, and we cut through that bullshit more easily on our side. But secondly, on their side, it's far harder for members of the public to plan interventions for people who are unwell, right? There's a less centralized knowledge source about how to even help people when you have more atomized ideas about how people behave, right? Tanae says it's okay. Everyone will understand that there people have quirks. There will be therapy for all these people. That's all well and good. And we can see that that probably happens on either side. The problem is if you don't have an awareness as to what kinds of things these people are likely to respond to on aggregate, you as an uninformed member of the public, if you're just like a random person, are less likely to find credible and authoritative ways to how to intervene with them. That means you're more likely to turn to poor solutions that come from social media. You're likely to do worse interventions for vulnerable individuals. But thirdly, the wisdom of the crowds is likely to actively discriminate against women and minorities. It took years and years for women's pain to be even taken seriously in the medical establishment. In the absence of clear explanations that these are actually serious problems coming from medical authorities, you're far more likely to either not believe it's a problem because that's what social media is telling you, or be led down a rabbit hole through bad social media, and that's particularly harmful. Finally, we contend that the rising awareness, given the absence of clear guidelines from the top down, you're vastly more likely to turn to non-licensed doctors, post-operative cures, and so on and so forth. On our side of the house, it's far more likely that women with postpartum depression, in the absence of medicine or name for it, turn elsewhere. Tanae says they pursue solutions. The problem is those solutions will be suboptimal. Why? Firstly, in the absence of medicine that can cure you, you literally can't get your symptoms under control, so your solutions are less likely to be optimal. Secondly, there's a variety of different voices that you can't discriminate against because on social media, you're unclear which is the most authoritative. Everybody seems to have credentials, and you're unsure which is the most important. Thirdly, you default to other community figures in the absence of trusting doctors that you have a very powerful voice in your life, your smart cousin, people who are close to you, as opposed to medical professionals. Thirdly, there's a race to the bottom, right, on social media. More radical voices are likely to be heard and rise to the top more frequently, meaning you're more likely to get extreme solutions like, I don't know, doing blood transfusions for mental health issues that could be actually harmful rather than just taking a pill that's unlikely to help you. Finally, if their counterfactual is true and the society just regards people as having different quirks and they're unlikely to diagnose them, that's really, really bad. So you don't have a name for the problem. You atomize solutions, divide movements that could otherwise help you fix these things. That's really, really bad. On our side of the house, medical authorities are often the first port of call for people. You abdicate them from the conversation on their side. What does this do to the debate? Firstly, it explains why on either side of the house will be lots of public pressure for solutions. This symmetrizes the second argument of OO and most of OG, because public pressure for solutions like alternatives like therapy will exist in either world. The problem is they're also going to pursue bad solutions on proposition. On our side of the house, not only we symmetrize OG and explain why alternative solutions are still available, we also provide a reason why people who trust the medical system are likely to opt in and buy into it to a significantly greater degree, thereby engaging more. The second impact I want to talk about is a loss of faith in the medical system more broadly. The first claim here is that if I'm seen as just quirky or whatever when I have a mental health issue, or when I'm seen to not have a specific thing to be diagnosed, when I go to the doctor and they say they can't give a label for me, it often makes me feel unfulfilled, right? If I have a heart condition, the doctor doesn't know what I have and keeps dismissing my pain as out of hand, I'm likely to turn to alternative medicine, turn to quacks, go to worse doctors, go to worse sources of information at that point. That happens far more on their side of the house rather than our side, right? But secondly, minority care is way more accessible on our side, right? The medical industry stopped neglecting minorities as hysterical or making stuff up precisely as a result of this trend. And this happened across all sectors of medicine because pathologization tells them they're valid and keeps them coming to the doctor. Among minority communities, like through the Tulsa medical experiments in the United States, have often opted out of these kinds of things. We increase the trust that they have to go to the doctor in the first place, but moreover, we encourage solutions to be found for their pain and their problems to make them taken more seriously. The upshot of all of this, we get more people going to the doctor, more people buying into solutions that are across the board, and on their side of the house, we symmetrize the main argument of opening government, which says that these things happen symmetrically. Before I go on, opening.
Yeah, as you identify, there is increasing awareness of mental health conditions. Why does pathologization on top of this lead to the right level of diagnosis?
If you listen to my speech, in the absence of pathologization, you don't have a clear authoritative voice that you turn to initially. Most people already have some degree of trust in the medical community because they believe in them, because they're their doctor that they go to, because they recognize they're not an authoritative figure on this. When you abdicate the voice in the conversation, you're no longer participating in the conversation of the medical community, you're not offering a diagnosis. That is the tipping point for people to buy into alternative discourse. Our claim is that this increased awareness happens in parallel. The difference is in the increased awareness in the absence of pathologization leads to every voice being taken seriously, and that's far worse. What is the second thing, the final argument I want to make here? R&D. To their credit, does a very good job with this. They already explained why you get way more critical drug development and so on and so forth. The problem is, Andrew and Tanae point out correctly, there are still profit incentives to develop drugs on either side, in which case you'll probably still get research into differences between different types of people. That's a fair response. What happens specifically on our side? Firstly, you're better able to quantify the specific number of people who have a condition. That allows you to determine which medicines to prioritize in the pipeline. Even if you develop medicines on either side of the house, you know what medicines you prioritize on our side, which is the missing link in opening opposition to make this argument attain solvency. Secondly, you're better able to identify gaps in the market when there are specific trends you can point to that are very similar on aggregate over many, many courses of action. Whereas when you do medicine develop on their side, it still happens, but it happens far slower. Thirdly, specific umbrella terms allow researchers to unify efforts and less duplicate costs. So R&D is a faster process on our side and slower on theirs because we're better for R&D, better for the most vulnerable, and we create discourse in society that allows marginalized people to uplift themselves in medical care. Incredibly proud to stand and see.
Thanks for the very fine speech. And I want to call the whip speaker from side government to close off the debate on government side. Here.
Am I audible? Okay, PY is non-verbally please. I will start my speech on my next word. Thank you. Over the course of my speech, I'm going to first address the O and then address OO and then finally rebuild some of our case and then do some weighing. So on to what closing opposition told us today, right? Closing opposition comes to us today and tells us how pathologization is more likely to create like the top-down approach that they want, right? It's more likely to be like information flows from doctors to people and whatnot, right? I want to make clear the mechanizations that William already gave you as to why that's not likely to happen. Just because you have more terms and just because there's like more awareness of something doesn't mean that doctor information from medical professionals is still going to trickle down to people in the most accurate manner. In fact, I would posit that the more terms you have, the more information gets lost in translation, even if you have that direct approach that closing opposition talks about, right? But William tells you the mechanization of the fact that a lot of people, especially like parents of kids, don't first ask the doctor what's going on. They ask people around them, or they ask people they care. Or they ask people who they trust, right? And then maybe they go to a doctor, right? So you're more likely not to get information directly from a doctor. You're more likely to get it from, as William tells you, social media, whatnot, right? They try to posit this statement that somehow when you have more terms, you're more likely to see a doctor and trust a doctor. I would like gut check this. If you have all sorts of terms, new medical terms that are being thrown at you, you're more likely to be confused and you're more likely to be stressed than actually say, hey, I want to go to a doctor and figure this out. You're more likely to try and do your own research or to talk to people who have heard about these terms, right? You're not going to go to a stranger and then say you're confused about all these different terms. So that mechanization just falls flat from closing opposition because the more terms you have, the more confused and stressed you get. You're not more likely to trust doctors when they're throwing random terms at you that you have no definitions or don't understand the meaning of, right? Now, going on to opening opposition, because a lot of what closing opposition now tells you after that is somewhat derivative off of OO, right? OO gives you two main arguments. A, they tell you there's going to be more capital, right? The problem is their argument is premised on the fact that pathologization is somehow going to spur the market more than it does right now. I'm going to tell you that the market exists right now for a lot of these mental health issues. For ADD, you have fidget spinners who came about like a decade ago. You know, as they mentioned, the market already exists for that demand because you don't have to be diagnosed with something to get a fidget spinner. You just need to feel as if you're stressed or maybe you're anxious, and then you might buy a fidget spinner. You don't have to be officially diagnosed to get a fidget spinner that or like any other sort of thing. So the market just isn't going to be more than what they tell you, right? But let's consider that it's true that the market is somehow going to be spurred, right? And better market of things doesn't necessarily seem to have the impact that they claim it's going to have. And here are the reasons why. It's because a lot of these conditions, as William tells you, apply to children and also can apply to young adults, right? Based on the mechanizations from OG, we know that young adults are more likely to be impressionable by social media and whatnot. All of these products on the market, they're not necessary to solve the problem. They're more so because they're more so to deal with the problem, right? It's not about solving the problem, it's about dealing with the problem. So yes, you have a product that can deal with the problem, but you want to fix to actually solve the issue, right? So it's not actually creating any sort of positive impact for these people, except providing them a small outlet through which they can deal with this. They're still suffering from these issues on a daily basis, right? But it's also the principle of it. Is it okay for firms to be capitalizing like this? They don't seem to mechanize why firms are going to create something that actually solves this issue rather than try to create something that is maybe more addictive to buy or something that they can make money off of, right? There's no mechanization that I get from opening opposition that proves that a better market is somehow going to create better products for these people, right? But let's go on to their second argument, which is that there's going to be more spending on mental health. I'm going to use their example against them. We've been researching cancer for years now with like tons of money, but we haven't found a cure to cancer yet. There's no guarantee on their side of the house that even if we apply more funding to these mental health issues, we're somehow going to understand how the brain works and we're going to be able to solve those issues. There's no sort of guarantee, but it's also about the time lag aspect of this. Sure, you put more money into mental health resources, but how long is this really going to take, right? We're talking about bureaucracy, shifting funding from government agencies to other government agencies. We're talking about doing that kind of research, which even at the end of that long term, there's just no guarantee that it's really going to happen, right? Also, the third part, how is this really going to trickle down to the most vulnerable? They keep positing that it's somehow just going to like trickle down to the most vulnerable and it's going to get cheaper. And I've already told you that there's no guarantee that that's going to happen. Why is that the case? Because A, we have patent laws for new drugs. Patent laws exist which allow firms to mark up their prices for a certain amount of time so they can't reduce the price, right? Two, capitalism. Again, no mechanization as to why these firms are going to want to create something that actually helps these people and lowers prices. So on that, both of their arguments in terms of weighing, I don't seem to understand the impact that they're really going for. And whatever impact they're going for is going to take long, and it's not even guaranteed to happen. Before that POI opening,
it doesn't matter if somebody thinks their autistic kid has ADHD. If the symptoms overlap and the solution fixes both problems, it is unclear why this misdiagnosis is harmful.
right? So that's what I don't seem to understand, right? You're telling me that somehow misdiagnosing a mental health issue or a mental health disorder is somehow not a big deal. I'm going to tell you, and this is going to go on to William's argument right now. We actually bring this debate to where it matters, which is like young kids and adults, or just young kids who are dependent on their parents, right? I've already mechanized to you as to why parents are not likely to take their kids to a doctor. They're more likely to want to deal with this issue themselves. Why? Because A, they may not trust the doctor due to all of these terms, and B, they may feel as if they're more capable of dealing with it because of the pervasiveness of these terms as well, right? It's totally possible that can happen. They don't trust their kids in the hands of doctors, more likely to make these decisions for these kids, right? So if your kid is showing some sort of symptoms and you as a parent say something and diagnose them as something, A, what is that going to do? The kid might do some of their own research because they're highly impressionable and they're highly curious, and they might start to go into this self spiral that, oh, I have this, when they don't actually have this. Or B, they misdiagnose something and now you're on the wrong medicine or you're in the wrong course of action and it becomes much, much worse, right? I don't see how somehow misdiagnosing is better than not diagnosing at all. Like, I just don't see that from opening opposition. That's absurd, right? So this is what we've told you today. We've told you that this is more likely to impact young kids who normally don't have resources to turn to, have to turn to their parents, and instead end up getting either misdiagnosed or diagnosed without the right resources, where in school now they are isolated, they're marginalized, and they're ostracized, right? It's easy for adults to go to a doctor and get diagnosed, right? We're going to acknowledge that. Like, yeah, they can go to a doctor and get diagnosed. Where this really matters is with the target audience we've told you. And that is why we take this case over opening government as well, because we constrain this debate.
Thanks so much for that very fine speech. And I want to call on the whip speaker from side opposition to close off this debate. Here.
POS, please, in the chat. I want to be very clear about the comparative. Awareness about mental health happens symmetrically on either side of the house. So on their side of the house, what happens is that on our side of the house, what happens is that you think you have autism or ADHD, and you go to the doctor and you can actually get diagnosis if you really have it. What happens on their side of the house is that, as OG states, doctor tells you, no, you can't function because you're just quirky. You're so sad and depressed because you're just quirky. You're just different. Just go home and learn to live with this. What do you do then? You either buy Ritalin on the street, you go to alternative medicine, or you completely lose the trust in the medical system, which is something that is much, much worse than someone maybe thinking that they have ADHD when they don't really have. And this is something that they have to stand for. It is also important to understand why did this happen in the first place, because what they have to stand for is continuation of the medicine in 90s. So what happened on ours? What happened differently? Why did this trend happen? Number one, we started acknowledging women. This is a really big thing. In the 90s, it was impossible to diagnose a woman. Only white boys were diagnosed with autism, for example, and women just had to suffer in silence without getting treatment that would literally revolutionize their lives. And other racial minority and racial minorities in general as well. But also, secondly, we understood how this can, manifest in different ways. What they have to stand for is continuation of certain groups of people, like women and minorities, not getting the treatment that they really need. I want to do more extraneous responses. So closing government, they say the information that you are going to get from doctor won't trickle. I don't think they understand our extension. What's different on our side is that you can go to the doctor. On their side of the house, you can't. On their side of the house, you will go to the doctor and you won't get proper diagnosis because we have more conservative view of what autism is. As opening governments themselves say, we will. What is going to happen is the doctors will tell you you're just different. People are different. People have different personalities. So on our side of the house, you actually can go to the doctor, can get diagnosis, and all these sorts of things. Secondly, they say doctors will confuse you with their terms. They want, why would they do this? Like, doctors don't have an incentive to confuse you. They want you to, come back to them and all these sorts of things. They don't want you to, this is just silly. Okay, let's talk about the opening government more. So what opening government says is, number one, overdiagnosis. And I want to be clear on this. Even in the absence of any of my rebuttals, notice how OG barely has a case. Because what they're talking about, in some instances, you may get overdiagnosis and then you maybe, have to take Ritalin for ADHD, which is going to cause harm of your heart. Number one, this case applies literally only to Ritalin, which is minority of the ADHD, which is minority of the debate. There's so many other mental disorders that are not treated by medicine, but treated by psychological therapy and psychiatrists and all these sorts of things, which are not covered by what opening government is talking about. But secondly, what they say, they're going to overprescribe it with medicine and all these kinds of things. I think it is unlikely to happen because doctors don't want to get sued for malpractice and all these sorts of things. But secondly, I want to flip this argument. Because what happens when you go to the doctor, when you actually go to the doctor, you are getting, like for Ritalin, for example, you're getting regular scans of your heart to see how Ritalin is affecting your body and all these sorts of things. What happens in the counterfactual is, you think you have ADHD, you can't function, you can't focus, you can't clean your room, you're failing all of your exams, and you buy Ritalin on street, or you buy speed or meth on street and take it in small doses because that's has similar effect, which means that, but you are taking this without the control of doctor, which means this is when it actually causes harm on your health and all these sorts of things, which means that we are because opening opposition is just mitigatory in this response, we are actually flipping this argument by proving that it's much worse in the counterfactual. Secondly, they say there's going to be more stigma. It won't be for two reasons. Number one, It won't be stigma because this is going to come from a doctor that is respected authority in the world. We generally respect doctors when they tell us something because like they are, like they are very well educated, they're saving our lives and all these sorts of things. If I can show my mom that doctor said I have ADHD, she has to, respect this because she respects doctors. She won't respect when I say, Mom, I read on Reddit and now I think I might be having ADHD and all these sorts of things, which means that there is going to be less stigma because it's going to come from a respected authority. Second reason why there's going to be less stigma is because it's going to become more normal. Like, for example, you're going to know your brother may be diagnosed with autism, your friend may be diagnosed with ADHD, and you are going to, through the contact theory, know these people and understand why, understand that they're not, crazy. Because in 90s, what was happening was huge stigmatization because we thought that these people are crazy. We were only talking about the worst instances of ADHD and autism and all these sorts of things. So this is something that changes on our side of the house. Next, they say that we are going to group the problems, we are going to overburden the public healthcare system, and therefore people who actually have these problems are not going to get proper diagnosis. Number one, I think OG is debating as if these are exclusively cases of overdiagnosis. They're not acknowledging the fact that a lot of people who had these conditions were not recognized before because doctors were sexist and they didn't recognize female symptoms as relevant as male symptoms. But before I explain more into that, OG?
So if 20% of people getting diagnosed right now and given mind-altering drugs, the likely counterfactual isn't that 0 people get diagnosed on our side, but probably more like 5%, given the increased awareness of on social media, etc., that we acknowledge on both sides, and long diagonal acknowledges will happen on both sides.
So you can't just come to the doctor and say, I read on Reddit and I think now I might have ADHD. What happens on our side of the house and how this thing happened in the first place is that doctors started understanding minorities more, and they also started prescribing more because there was more research and all these sorts of things. Next, what I wanted to say is that yes, because more people are getting diagnosed, there's going to be incentives of state to pull more money into this sort of thing. State is going to fund more research and more clinics so more people can get diagnosed and all these sorts of things. But also secondly, private clinics will be opening and all these sorts of things. And the even if cases, that worst case on their side of the house is some person who think that they have ADHD, some person might get overdiagnosed. They might think that they have ADHD and they take, I don't know, Ritalin, which is equivalent to drinking 5 cups of coffee a day. Worst cases that is going to happen on their side, that's going to happen on their side is that thousands of women and racial minorities and all these other people who had these conditions would never get diagnosed in the first place, which can literally, these mental disorders can literally ruin your life. And that's why I'm proud to oppose.
Thanks so much for